or the drama. When Napoleon embarked upon the Bellerophon, he was treated as an emperor, receiving royal recognition and everywhere taking the first place. The British government then took it into its head to deny him his imperial title, basing its decision upon not the double abdication, but upon the assertion that it had never officially recognized this rank. Actually, it had for 15 years, avoided with remarkable persistency every opportunity it had of attributing to the head of the French government the title which that people had conferred upon him, which the head of the Catholic religion had ratified, and which all kings and emperors had acknowledged, even while negotiating with him. For instance, at Châtillon, the English ambassadors had avoided addressing him as emperor. It is true that in this last instance, they had novel means for avoiding it on account of the action of the emperor's representative, who, in all the protocols, had admitted that he was called the ambassador of France, or the French ambassador, and had never claimed his master's rights. Further, while ratifying so far as it concerned itself, the Treaty of Fontainebleau on April 11th, 1814, Great Britain had at first presented a draft which was not accepted. On April 27th, it returned and forthwith gave its agreement to a treaty which had for its object the granting to the person and family of Napoleon Bonaparte sovereign possession of the island of Elba and the duchies of Parma, Plaisance, and Guastella, as well as other articles, with this exception that His Royal Highness should not, by this act of accession, be considered a contracting party in the name of His Majesty to any of the other stipulations contained in it. From the very first, it concerned itself with the titles retained by Napoleon and the members of his family when the outrageous violations of the Treaty of Fontainebleau by the government of Louis XVIII had forced the emperor under conditions well known to everyone to come to reclaim the right he had to live in France. The Allied powers charged Napoleon Bonaparte with having destroyed the only legal title with which his existence was connected, and asserted that he had put himself outside the pale of civil and social relations, and that as an enemy and a disturber of the peace of the world, he had been delivered up to prosecution. There is no doubt they intended, after this last declaration, to put a price on his head, but they dared not do it. At least not officially. From that moment, the emperor was no more to them than Napoleon Bonaparte. The you being inserted as an insult and additional humiliation. Legitimate sovereigns reigning in Europe then declared his deposition in the name of the Blessed Trinity, and by virtue of the rights which a legitimate sovereign has over its people, on the same consideration they had transformed into a prisoner the guest who had come to take shelter under the British flag. Thenceforward, he would be confined in a fortified enclosure shielded from view, treated as a general officer, frequently referred to by his rank, and if permitted to reckon on being given his discharge. That was a great concession. So bitter were the insults thus inflicted on his dignity that Napoleon was reduced on board the Northumberland to consider himself a passenger forced to endure, as in a floating in, the ribald jests of his hosts. Nevertheless, if the admiral had plainly indicated that he had intended to remain master of his own vessel, he had at least acted courteously. He came into the cabin at 5 o'clock to inform the emperor that dinner was ready, and if the two courses lengthened the meal to an hour or an hour and a half, there was an air of the most genteel politeness. The admiral went out of his way to do the honors, shortening the meal the emperor found too long, and did not take offense at his rising from the table when he had finished, all the diners standing up as he left. The emperor also became familiar enough to play vingt-et-un with him. All on board the vessel, from the lowest cadet to the colonel of the 53rd, Sir George Bingham, paid him a regard and a deference indicated by their actions, gestures, and general attitude towards him. The admiral used to come to present himself to the emperor after dinner, and if the emperor took his arm and prolonged the conversation, he used to appear very honored. In this manner, his prejudices were dispelled. With the great soldier, these soldiers understood with whom they were dealing. Enemies though they all were, they had admired and respected him, whom fortune had raised high only to hurl him down. They had fallen for the charm of his genius, for that attraction which he exercised over anyone who approached him, and who added the clear light of his gray eyes to the irresistible charm of a smiling mouth. They had seen how simple he was in his manner and habits, sober, easy to please, in want of nothing, and they had for him that kind of admiration born in any man who cared to consider the contrast between the grandeur of his former state and the equanimity with which he bore his present lot, given more freedom even in this detention than the members of his retinue. The emperor had his likes and dislikes, and lived almost solely with the Grand Marshal in Las Casas. The latter acted as his interlocutor, which pleased him, since almost all his life and his record were new to him. Las Casas gave him just the inches calculated to produce a reactive effect, reminding him of engagements, recalling names to him, settling proceedings between kinsfolk, or relationship between sovereign families, and supporting the ideas on which the Ancien Regime was founded, and the France of the emigration, a member of which he had been. In short, he showed admiration, the sincerity of which was evidenced by his devotion in voluntary exile. The emperor knew he kept a diary and appeared to have no objection, but the narrative therein contained was only written in fits and starts, and Las Casas was ardently desirous of compiling the history of the memoirs of the emperor. Napoleon, for his part, had a long time since conceived a similar plan. I wish he had said to the soldiers of his old guard, when bidding them adieu at Fontainebleau, I wish to write of the wonderful deeds we have done together. Little persuasion was necessary to make up his mind, and without waiting to land at St. Helena, or procure books wherein to find dates, corroboration of facts, and a guide to his memory, he began to dictate to Las Casas, and before long this work so took possession of him that he spent all available time on it. He even tried to learn English from Las Casas, who, it appears, knew a little. The translations of English pieces which he gave him were dreadfully faulty, and after a few lessons he became discouraged in finding it more difficult to write than to speak, added to which his natural inaptitude for foreign languages was one of the characteristic phenomena of his brain. He seemed not to have been able to speak Italian correctly, and despite the consequent relations he had with the Germans from the Ulm campaign until that of Leipzig, a period of nearly 9 years, he had never had the inclination or the patience to attempt to learn German. As for English, although he had at first shown some keenness, he failed to maintain it, and if at intervals he resumed the attempt, it was obvious that he never learned enough to consult the annual register or read a paper, actually his history, either what related to it or contained incidents which he could affirm was only to amuse him. No other study occupied him at that moment. The only way he busied himself was by recalling his campaigns, by ruminating upon their moves, by expounding upon their results, by conceiving or deducing the reasons for his triumphs and the causes of his failures, never once entering into any philosophical or moral discussion. It was on September 9th that he began to dictate the story of his life to Las Casas, and went as far as the siege of Toulon. Then he passed on to the Italian campaigns. After the first dictation, he displayed little keenness, but the regularity with which Las Casas pursued it, the habit was acquired, the endeavor, once bearing fruit, stimulated him, and he found a fascination in the work which rendered it almost a necessity. Thenceforth he adopted a mode of work which remained unchangeable so long as he could push along successfully with it, so long as he found a diversion from his unhappy lot, so long as he was assisted by collaborators capable of listening to him. About 11 o'clock in the morning he would send for Las Casas, who would read to him the dictation transcribed the previous evening, of which his son had made a fair copy. He would make corrections and then dictate again until 4 o'clock. Las Casas would then hasten to the apartment assigned to him by the mainmast, the embrasure of a cannon secluded by a sail, and there he would dictate to his son, his cabin companion, what he had compiled thanks to a kind of shorthand reporting and to an impression fresh from his memory. In the evening, whilst walking on the bridge, the emperor would revert to the morning's dictation. The following morning, upon beginning, he complained that this dictation business had become burdensome to him. He seemed to distrust himself, saying that he would never reach any result. He then ruminated a few minutes, arose, began to pace up and down, and commenced to dictate. And from that moment, he was another man. Everything came naturally. He spoke like one inspired. Expressions, dates, places, nothing any longer stayed his progress. Each corrected dictation necessitated a new dictation of the same subject, but with a different interpretation. The second version, more exact, more comprehensive, and better constructed, sometimes even different from the first. The following day, the second version was put before the emperor. At the first correction, he dictated everything again, and his third dictation incorporated the first two, thus making one whole. Hereafter, were he to dictate a fourth, a seventh, a 10th time, which was not unprecedented, there were always the same ideas, the same content, almost the same expressions of speech. That accounts for the number of versions of certain narratives which are extant, and the kind of similarity existing between them. But the emperor was not content to dictate to Las Casas only. From October 7th, he began to dictate to Gorgo, and upon the same epics of his life, the siege of Toulon and the Italian campaigns, as if he was desirous of comparing the narrative which his dictations produced and the profit thereby for a final version. This was without doubt the principal pastime of the voyage, on which recreation, chess, and 21 was the sole diversion. It was just the same during the early days of St. Helena. The emperor, upon disembarking at Jamestown after dinner on Tuesday, October 7th, remained only one night in the boarding house kept by a Mr. Porteous. At 6 o'clock the following morning, he mounted his horse and accompanied the Admiral Cockburn and the Grand Marshal, and attended by only one servant. He went to visit Longwood, which was intended for him, and breakfasted there with the Skelton family, who were living there in accordance with his disposition at the time, which was to avoid the curious. He found this solicitude not too displeasing, and he did not look too closely into the serious inconvenience which the sight generated, and which the insecurity of the building and the absence of cellars aggravated. If the Skeletons, who were well-intentioned, gave any information, it was concerning the summer months, during which Longwood was definitely much cooler and much less stifling than Jamestown, since there was, so was said, a difference between the two places of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but they did not know it was to be a winter as well as a summer residence, that the emperor was doomed to a sedentary existence without any recourse to the town, in a country where the miserable vegetation contrasted still more sharply with the height of the mountains, the ruggedness of the rocks, and the giddy depths of the abysses. Such a nature did not permit one to be gladdened by grass or flowers. She remained harsh and discouraging, with her trees dwarfed and hung with half-dead foliage, all leading the same direction because of the force of the wind, and presenting the appearance of fleeing in terror. The emperor, however, who had just spent 3 months on the sea, found himself in the same position as visitors from China or England, by whom the legend of this earthly paradise was founded, and appeared satisfied. On the other hand, did he want to express an opinion, a personal opinion, of his prison? From the moment when England assumed the right to incarcerate him, might he not have considered that it would be becoming of that country at least to examine cursorily what comfort he would enjoy? The Grand Marshal was not the man to hint at such complaints, any more than Napoleon, for his part, would have been the man to utter them, at least at this outset.